have Arabic interpretation available for those that want to listen to it in Arabic. We're here to discuss what I think is a very important and pertinent topic, the legacy of the Second Intifada for Palestinians. We're talking about that today, not just because of the parallels we see in what is unfolding on the ground today, but also because of how much that period has shaped the present reality in Palestine. When I was there a few months ago, Israeli military raids on Jenin and Nablus were a daily occurrence. Everyone was discussing it and wondering what was going to happen. And one night I was having dinner with a couple activists and organizers from Fatah that were around my age, around 40. And I asked them for their thoughts and analysis of the situation. And I wasn't really satisfied with their answers. So I probed a bit deeper. I asked them, what did they learn from the Second Intifada? This was something that had been on my mind. What lessons had they taken from that incredibly important period that taught them as political organizers? And they, like me, had been in their late teens when it had started and in their 20s when it had ended. So they remembered the period vividly. It was formative, in fact, and yet their answers I felt lacked some substance to my ears. So I've invited two really excellent Palestinian thinkers to join us today, who were both active writing during the Second Intifada as journalists and researchers, two of only a very small few, I think, that were writing in English at the time, to share their insights and help us kind of unpack that seminal period in Palestinian history that still looms so large over the present. First, we have Ramzi Baroud, who is a Palestinian-American journalist and the author of 6 books, including 2 on the Second Intifada. He's currently the editor of the Palestine Chronicle and is the former deputy managing editor of Al Jazeera Online. Ramzi has kindly taken time out of his very busy book tour schedule to join us, so thank you, Ramzi. His latest book is co-edited with Ilan Pape and is called Our Vision for Liberation, Engage Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. We'd also like to welcome back Noor Odeh, who has joined us before. Noor is a prominent political analyst, a researcher, consultant, and a former journalist based in Ramallah. She covered the Second Intifada as a journalist from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Afterwards, Noor was Al Jazeera English's senior correspondent in the West Bank from 2006 to 2011. So thank you, Noor. So I'm just going to jump right into questions with a very brief pretext for the conversation so that we can maximize our time and really dig deep into these questions over the next hour. And then I'll start taking questions from the audience with the last 15 minutes or so. Noor, let's start with you. The common understanding or common knowledge of how the Intifada began is that a couple months beforehand, in July 2000, there was the Camp David Summit in the US, hosted by Bill Clinton and attended by Ehud Barak and a reluctant Yasser Arafat. It ended in spectacular fashion and was, kind of capped what had been for Palestinians a rather disastrous peace process that began in 1993 with the Oslo Accords and was supposed to end with final status negotiations within 5 years, but in which the conditions on the ground in the occupied territories, the economy and everything else had deteriorated immensely. And that the uprising itself was precipitated by the infamous and intentionally provocative visit of Ariel Sharon to the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, escorted by around 1,000 armed guards in late September 2000. And that Sharon, being perhaps the most loathed Israeli of all time for Palestinians, which is saying something, him entering that holy site was kind of like throwing a match in a gas tank. It sparked angry protests by Palestinians in Jerusalem, which were violently suppressed by Israeli forces. People were killed, the protests spread, more people were killed, and then a full-scale rebellion ensued. So Noor, what else should we know about, what gave rise to the Intifada, how it took shape in that context, its unique character? Take us through, both as an analyst and as an eyewitness to those events, and give us a good background if you can. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I think this is a very good place to start because I remember that period, and I remember that you could feel in the air that something was about to happen. Everybody was reaching kind of a breaking point, if you will. At the political level, you had Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership having arrived at the conclusion that this was there was a dead end, so to speak, in terms of talks in terms of American mediation. Israeli politics was gearing towards the right, and even though Ehud Barak at the time was prime minister and wanted to show himself as a progressive or a leftist and so on the ground, the practices really were geared towards proving that he was the tough man. So when the protest started, the Israeli reaction was so violent, so severe, so immediate. It left really no room for the brakes to be put on by anybody. And almost immediately, we saw a very systematic assault on the PA, a destruction of its institutions, of its buildings, of its ability to function, and a complete breakdown of any path towards political dialogue. Conversely, of course, you had a situation where the Palestinian public was more enjoying a moment of consensus, if you will, about the need to chart a different path towards freedom and to reassert our right to liberation, to ending the occupation, without having to prove, so to speak, to the occupier that we were worthy of negotiations, of good marks, so to speak, and what they used to call the goodwill measures from the Israelis. But of course, you can start an uprising of that kind, or an uprising starts, in one way, but there's really very limited ways in which you can control where it goes. And the way the Intifada kind of progressed and where it went, especially after a certain point and after the siege laid to Yasser Arafat, I think left a lot of lessons. The most important, perhaps, so that I can finish this answer, is the very clear divide in terms of conclusions between Palestinian age groups. So on the one hand, you had the grown-ups, right? The people in the leadership, 50 and above in terms of age group, drawing certain conclusions about what to do and what not to do with Israel. And the most stark conclusion was, don't mess with the Israelis. The Americans won't have our side. The Arabs will abandon us. And so we have to play nice. On the other hand, there was the other age group, 40 and below, who grew up with new figures to look up to, with new icons that they can study and follow in the footsteps of. And so that divide only grew wider after the Intifada. And I think what we see now is all of that coming full circle. The older generation wanting to acquiesce in a way or another, wanting to just survive politically and not be attacked by Israel, and the younger generation, which is the majority of Palestinians, wanting to go towards freedom without advancing excuses, without having to be on the good side of Israel, of the US administration, or anybody else. And in many ways, that changed the conversation, I think, on Palestine.
Thank you for that. I mean, how, maybe just to expand a little bit, how was it similar or different than anything that had kind of come before it or after in the Palestinian experience? As a rebellion, I mean, we can juxtapose it to the first Intifada, but as resistance is kind of ongoing to the occupation, which is much older for Palestinians. I mean, how was this particular moment defined and how it kind of evolved?
I think it's very different from the first Intifada. The first Intifada was more a popular uprising. It involved the masses. There were no formal Palestinian institutions. There was no Palestinian governance at that time. The second Intifada quickly went in the direction of armed resistance. There was a Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian factions were on the ground, and they had their own also armed formations. And so the participation of the masses was limited. As soon as the guns were drawn, people kind of took a back step and they became more the popular support for the resistance, for armed resistance, than active participants, so to speak, like the first Intifada would be. But I think it also marked a period where I would call it the beginning of the demise of Palestinian factions, where all of these factions were exposed for having run out of ideas, of vision, of the ability to lead politically, to introduce a different kind of vision for where and how Palestinian freedom can be achieved. And I think that applies across the board. Hamas and Islamic Jihad maybe, had longer traction in terms of carrying through with their following and with their rhetoric. But I think all in all, the Second Intifada marked a period where the Palestinian polity, the crisis of Palestinian politics, came into high focus, and it just never recovered from that.
Ramzi, would like to add some thoughts on that and how the kind of Intifada, should be understood and defined, how it evolved over time?
Absolutely. I think just the term Intifada itself, I think it needs to be deconstructed a bit more here, because who decides what is an Intifada and what's not an Intifada? Is that a decision made by the media? Is it made by academics? Is it made by people in the street? And I think trying to understand that term in itself should also help us understand this. Quite often we hear about people asking, is this the third Intifada? Or when will the third Intifada start? And so forth and so on. And so we've been having all these kind of false declarations of new Intifadas, and we haven't really settled yet on what is the third Intifada, or if it started or not. I lived the entirety of the first Intifada in Gaza, particularly in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. And I recall that being an entirely different process that channeled the second Intifada. The first Intifada started as an outcome of several kind of failures happening at several levels. On the one hand, you had the collapse of the PLO as a relevant platform for Palestinian resistance, the move from Lebanon to Tunisia and elsewhere in 1982. And then there's just feeling that Israel has won. Israel kind of behaved as if it has won. They were talking about some sort of autonomy given to the Palestinians, no national aspirations, no political horizon, nothing. It's done with. Well, during that time, there was a new kind of intellect that's happening in Palestine through various universities, Beir Zayt and Najah, Islamic University and others, where there is a new type of leadership that were emanating from the Palestinian society itself. They were very engaged, they were very involved in the everyday lives of Palestinians, from Hanan Ashrawi to Haidar Abd al-Shafi to many others. And that was forming a different type of political awareness and a new type of political discourse in Palestine. Ultimately, that became the first Intifada. It was a spontaneous process, a truly spontaneous process, a decision that was made right there and then on the streets of Jabalia, then Nusayrat refugee camp, then Aida refugee camp, and suddenly throughout Palestine, then Palestine 48, then even Palestinian encampments and regions in Jordan and in Lebanon. The second Intifada was a different process, because it's like the best way to describe it as if it was like several Intifadas all at once. The popular component of it was indeed there. Palestinians were angry, they were frustrated. Oslo achieved very little for them in terms of their political expectations. The economy of Palestine was being deteriorated as more Israeli settlements were being built. The number of Jewish settlers were increasing exponentially throughout the occupied territories. And a lot of people, even those who have supported Arafat and Fatah at the time, were kind of scratching their heads saying, but wait a minute, is this the coveted peace? And if this is what peace is, then what, what is military occupation? So there was that component that was a very relevant and important component, but there were the other components as well. One coming from the Palestinian Authority itself, it was growing politically bankrupt. It was losing its credibility among Palestinians. And Yasser Arafat goes in that final hurrah to Camp David to, come back with, a final agreement to deal with the issues of Jerusalem, the refugees, border, water, and all of that. And he comes back completely empty-handed, not only empty-handed, but also extremely frustrated, feeling betrayed and humiliated in the media. We all remember what happened with the Ehud Barak generous offer, and how all the fingers were now pointing at Yasser Arafat for being the one supposedly responsible for this mayhem. Right? So the man himself was extremely angry, and he needed to maintain a degree of credibility within the Fatah movement, within the Palestinian Authority, but also among his supporters and among all Palestinians throughout the West Bank and Gaza, especially that you have movements like Hamas, particularly Hamas, but others kind of waiting outside, pointing the finger also at Arafat, saying, we told you so. And we all know what happened to Palestinian political dissidents who disagreed with Arafat and the Palestinian Authority at the moment. At that moment, we know of the torture, we know of the anti-opposition campaign that started under the auspices of the Americans, who were putting more and more demands on Yasser Arafat. So that second intifada was supposed to be this kind of magical resolution for everything. Yasser Arafat need to escape that trap and reassert his revolutionary, credibility among his own people, and say, and remember, there was that famous saying when he said that I cannot give you Jerusalem because my people will kill me, something of that effect. And of course, American media kind of spun it into all sorts of ways. Oh, he is a coward, he is this and he is that. But he was trying to tell the Americans and the Israelis, the decision is not in my hands, look at my people. They are the ones in the streets. For Yasser Arafat, he wanted this to be a quick intifada. He wanted this to be a very strong message. I am not alone, I'm not isolated, my people are with me. What he did not anticipate, perhaps, and I argued that in my book, The Second Intifada, and in My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, where I spoke about how what he did not anticipate, perhaps, is the fact that the environment in Palestine itself was kind of ready for an actual, genuine, popular intifada in the streets. And that's what allowed that intifada to carry on from 2000 till 2005. And Arafat, he could not control it. Unlike what happened with the first intifada, where it was a spontaneous process that carried on for several years, using its own mechanisms and its own energies. But later on, the PLO from Tunisia tried to interfere in the workings of that intifada. And we all remember Abu Jihad's involvement and others, and that's why he was assassinated eventually. But how they tried to kind of restructure the first intifada in a way that could become useful for the PLO and Fatah in particular in terms of politics and strategy.
Thank you for that, showing the kind of dynamics, I think, that led to it, and the various forces that were taking place at the same time, and the complexity of it. I think that's important. Ramzi, I want to stick with you for a second. And this is, one of the main topics that I really wanted to address, is that, if we think for a moment of history as the distillation of past events into a common narrative, which is used to remember and to teach lessons, what is the Palestinian history of the Second Intifada? What does Palestinian society tell itself about that period, and what are the lessons that are informing people today, especially if we consider that if you're an 18-year-old Palestinian, you were likely born, in 2005, so you were not alive during the Intifada, and that 60% of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories is under the age of 24 and likely has no memory of that time. So how is it understood, at large, and also by this kind of new generation that didn't experience it firsthand?
I think in the minds of many Palestinians, and it's kind of difficult to speak on behalf of anyone, especially if you're speaking on behalf of people, but just trying to imagine this based on what we know since then. on the writings of Palestinians, on the behavior, the collective sentiments that comes out from Palestine or came out of Palestine during that time. I think the Second Intifada was the end of Oslo. I think from a cultural point of view, the idea that Oslo was a thing and it was relevant and it could have had potential, and there's a thing called a peace process, I think that was it. I know that even until today, you have intellectuals, you have political analysts, and you have politicians, still talking about the renewal of the peace process and returning to the negotiations table. As far as the Palestinian people are concerned, that chapter was closed back there. Number two, the relationship between the Palestinian leadership and between the Palestinian people has also changed fundamentally. That any element of trust that the Palestinians had in the Palestinian Authority kind of died with Yasser Arafat, died with the Second Intifada, and a whole new stage of relationships and representations was born out of it. That's when the Americans became very much involved, along with the Jordanians and the Egyptians and others, in the training of Palestinian Authority personnel who were no longer at that point seen as our children. I do remember when the Palestinian Authority first arrived to Gaza, and I remember my dad inviting all these police officers, coming from Beirut, coming from Cairo and elsewhere, to our house, and had that sense of excitement that people had in the neighborhood when all these well-dressed Palestinians coming with their flags and their uniforms. It was something so novel, so exciting for us. That sentiment and that romance kind of died out when the Palestinian Authority was reinvented by General Keith Dayton and others following the Second Intifada, and they kind of were used as a way to control the Palestinian street. The third and final thing that I can think of is that of the relationship between Palestinians and armed struggle. And I do believe that what happened in Gaza since then, the rise of the Palestinian, kind of armed groups in Gaza, and eventually many armies that are operating in Gaza at the moment, and also the return to armed struggle in the northern West Bank, particularly Jenin, Nablus, but also, as we have seen lately, Al-Khalil and Jericho as well. All of these things kind of like really go back to the Second Intifada. The idea that we can be, fighting units. We can actually stand or withstand the pressures of having to fight against a standing army like the Israeli army. So with all the bad things that came out of the Second Intifada, there were a degree of collective confidence that emerged out of it. And in my opinion, this was one of the main reasons of why Israel cracked down with so much ferocity. I mean, they were bombing protesters with F-35s from the air. I mean, and Apaches. They wanted to send the message to the Palestinians: don't get ideas. This is not Lebanon 78. This is not Lebanon 82. Those years are behind us. There's a different type of relationship, but that did not work. And we've seen the return to armed struggle in Gaza, and now we are seeing it kind of taking its first nascent steps in the West Bank as well.
Thank you. Noor, I want to turn to you on this same question. Because, when I look at Palestinian history, I think, the kind of mandate period has a collective memory for Palestinians, or in a collective narrative. The Nakba period and the post-Nakba period as well. The rise of a Palestinian, return of a Palestinian nationalism, the formation of the PLO, all those periods, even the First Intifada as well. There's a common narrative around it. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to the Second Intifada, has that been digested? When I look at the Israeli side, I think they have dug into that and they have their own lessons. Palestinians probably don't agree with those lessons, but they have kind of informed Israeli politics in a particular way. And I'm just wondering, for Palestinians, is there that common narrative? And when we break it down, like, you can take things that are much more even specific in terms of how it's taught in schools, how it's memorialized by Palestinian society, by the political factions, by the PA or PLO, if at all. Is it all heroism and sacrifice? Is it introspection and instruction? Is there, again, a common remembrance, or is it disputed between, does Hamas have its version of the Intifada and Fatah have its own version? Or is there a kind of a collective memory here that supersedes all of that?
I wish there was more introspection in Palestinian politics. We wouldn't be where we are now if Palestinian factions drew lessons from their experiences and corrected mistakes or learned from them at the very least. I think the second Intifada, there are three versions, in my opinion, of the second Intifada. One is used and invoked by PLO factions when there is a need, when they're in a kind of a tight spot and they need to remember days of the struggle and so on, and their involvement in the sacrifice of their members. There is a version that advanced by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who kind of ran a parallel, if you will, to the PLO in terms of actions and in terms of claiming responsibility and so on. Each side downplaying the other's involvement and influence. And then there is the conclusion or the version of ordinary Palestinians. And that is conflicted. It's not all about heroism, although there was plenty of that. But ordinary Palestinians also remember the ensuing chaos. They remember the fact that there was no one they could talk to when things went astray, when young Palestinian men with guns took it upon themselves to put down new rules in Palestinian cities. And I don't think that this has been studied enough or discussed enough. There's almost an aversion to kind of studying what the second Intifada was and what it did and what the consequences of that period were on Palestinian politics, on Palestinian psyche, including the fact that Palestinians, after the untimely death of Yasser Arafat, after the death of that era, if you will, and the convening of Palestinian elections, the winning, the victory of Hamas, and then the takeover of Gaza, all of those, in my opinion, are consequences of the second Intifada, of the failings and the victories of the second Intifada. And some of the opportunistically framed victories of that Intifada. And in a way, we find ourselves now with a divided political system, with Palestinians having very different realities. In the West Bank, they can't stand those who rule them. In Gaza, there is also a lot of disappointment and resistance to the de facto government in Gaza. Nobody is happy as far as ordinary Palestinians are concerned. They do not see their voices represented by those in power. They don't see their interests represented. And at the same time, each side invokes the national good, if you will, the previous sacrifices or the ongoing sacrifices, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, I think right now, as far as the political players are concerned, the second Intifada is a basket of troves that you can pick and choose from to achieve your political ends, but it's not really something that has been studied or used to assess what works and what doesn't and where we can go from there. And I think what we see in the Northern West Bank, what we see in Hebron, is not necessarily a return to the second Intifada. In my opinion, it's a statement of revolt against Palestinian factions. And I know that some of those formations, directly or indirectly, are tied to Palestinian factions. But if you look at the conduct of these groups, to me, it's quite obvious that their statement is, we will not be tools in your toolbox to use when you want and to put away when you want. We see one path forward, and that path has nothing to do with power. It has nothing to do with control. It has to do with the purity of resistance, if you will. And that also explains why ordinary Palestinians view them as credible, as groups that deserve support, because they they don't have a political agenda. That has its risks and dangers. But I like I said at the beginning of our conversation, I think the most important highlight of all of this is the fact that Palestinian factions, all of them, are in crisis, and they're becoming less and less relevant and credible to ordinary Palestinians who want to achieve freedom at the end of the day, through armed struggle, through popular resistance, through whatever. But that's the end goal. And they see that factions have strayed, if you will, from that.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. And you often hear, I think, prominent, maybe older Fatah officials, pointing at their track record, but from such an earlier period, in the heyday of the 70s, as opposed to what's happened now, and especially even the Oslo period and what came after the Second Intifada. Ramzi,
and if I may, that's not to downplay the fact that there are a lot of Fatah members who did engage in sacrifice and in the struggle and in the armed resistance of the Second Intifada, and even now. But we can't really attribute that to a political agenda on any faction side. These are individuals who have engaged out of conviction and commitment to the cause, if you will, as far as they're concerned, but not because there was a party or faction decision to do so.
Ramzi, you alluded to this already, to militarization and also to Lebanon. You said 78 and 82. At the beginning of your book on the Second Intifada, you say that some people argue that the Intifada was actually rooted in South Lebanon, that Israel's exit from Lebanon in May 2000 at the hands of Hezbollah had, invigorated Palestinian faith in armed struggle, had shaken the confidence of the Israeli military, which was then trying to reassert itself in the West Bank and Gaza. Can you explain those two facets and how they help shape the militarization of the Second Intifada on both sides, on the Israeli side and also on the Palestinian side? When I personally, for a long time, I've looked at the Lebanese experience and the Second Intifada as Palestinians, kind of looking to Hezbollah and its success there in expelling the Israelis as something to emulate, in the same way that an earlier generation of Palestinian fighters, Fedayeen, may have looked to the FLN and Algeria and its anti-colonial struggle as something to emulate. You're muted.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So the Palestinian Revolution, the modern Palestinian Revolution, we're talking about Fatah in the 60s, and I don't know if we could consider the Palestine Liberation Army's experience in particular relevant to this conversation, because it happened within the political hegemony and context of Egypt and other Arab countries, but definitely since the rise of Fatah. And if you examine the constitution of Fatah in particular, you will find obvious references they made to the war against colonialism in Algeria and other, anti-colonial models. It was always kind of situated within an armed struggle model, and to some degree they had enough to go by. I mean, enough evidence to make them feel that we are actually making a difference. The West Bank experience wasn't as successful as the Gaza experience, particularly in the rise of the Fedayeen movement almost immediately after the Nakba in the early 50s, 60s, 70s, and then you have that kind of disruption that happened in 1982, and then and that was supposed to be kind of the disappointing end of the Palestinian armed revolution. Then Hezbollah happened. Then the resistance in Lebanon happened. And for the first time in many, many years, not only within the collective imagination of Palestinians, but honestly, any Arab polity as well, an Arab resistance group groups are able to assert some sort of a war opposition against Israel. This is unprecedented. Guerrilla warfare usually don't work that way, but Lebanon made it happen. And we can talk about that. That's a whole different conversation of why did that actually take place in Lebanon, but it did. And the fact is, no matter how the Israelis tried to rewrite that history, it was the Lebanese resistance, particularly in the south, that pushed Israel out. So you had this kind of crisis happening within the political establishment in Israel. And in the book, I kind of examined a lot of the political discourse coming from Israeli official sources, but also Israeli media. The deterrence, everybody was so stressed out about the deterrence, very similar to what happened recently with Yair Lapid when he met, had the security briefing with Netanyahu a few days ago, and he came out screaming and, about the whole deterrence. We have lost our deterrence because of what has taken place in the West Bank and Gaza as of late. So there was so much obsession with Israel losing its deterrence. That was the moment that Palestinians rebelled in Palestine, or within that historical context. The Israelis, and they also, that was not my personal interpretation, that's what they were saying very clearly. We need to teach the Palestinians a lesson. We need to let them know that this is not Lebanon. And what happened in Lebanon will not have a repeat in the West Bank. So that's why the Israelis were quite violent from the very, very beginning to send a very strong message. We haven't lost our deterrence. This is not Lebanon. But on the Palestinian side as well, now remember, there was like a massive amount of weapons that were available to the Palestinian Authority, to the various factions during that period, and there were that great sense of inspirations. In fact, various types of Palestinian flags were kind of changing in their symbolism to mimic that of Hezbollah during that time. And that's kind of particularly interesting, that kind of direct relationship that the resistance in Palestine have with the resistance in Lebanon or throughout the region. There's an immediate relationship there. And they felt inspired that we could also repeat the Hezbollah model as well. And third element that I think was, could also be of relevance is that for years there was some sort of connection going on between the Palestinians and the resistance in Lebanon, starting with the Marj Zuhur, with the deportation of hundreds of Palestinian leaders and activists to Lebanon, and the follow-up that happened over the course of years, where they continued that kind of communication throughout that period. So indeed, there was, both sides looked at Lebanon. I don't know why it has been written out of the story of the Second Intifada, but for those who were reporting on the Second Intifada as it was happening, the Lebanon connection was, very, very clear to everybody who's whether examining the Israeli discourse or the Palestinian discourse as well.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of important things that you touched on. I mean, the deterrence factor, I think, is huge from the Israeli point of view. And, we see all the time how I think the Israelis use the captive populations, both in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as almost an instrument of Israeli politics. Whenever, it can serve domestic Israeli politics between the left, the right, between this person and this person, to show who's tough, to show who's whatever, that population is there to kind of beat up as a punching bag, so to speak. But also in the same way you said, to show the Palestinians that this is not South Lebanon, the West Bank is different. There's also the kind of history that you mentioned, but Fatah and Arafat also were instrumental, I think, in some of the creation of Hezbollah. Well, really the division of Amal in Lebanon at the time and the training of different things. I think Hezbollah came under the wing of the IRGC in Iran later, but the Palestinians were also instrumental, I think, early on in that element too. And so there's some interesting history that you can unpack and dig into it. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the time to go into there. Noor, I wanted to ask you, when it comes to armed resistance and the militarization of the Intifada, armed resistance, I think, is inherently divisive, because only a minority of people can take part in it, compared to an unarmed, total resistance, rebellion, in the same way as the first Intifada, in which all facets of society can participate. Even children can find a role participating in that. That's not to say that armed and unarmed conflict or struggle can't be employed simultaneously, but one tends to kind of crowd out and overshadow the other. One thing I kind of wanted to mention is there's a book by a scholar named James Rahn who talks about the frontier and the ghetto, and that he talks about actually the first Intifada, and he compares it to Yugoslavia and shows how the Palestinian territories during the first Intifada were treated as a ghetto, and the use of violence from the Israeli side in that period is more akin to kind of like brutal policing. And when it comes to the frontier is a much more violent militaristic element. And it seems like that the Second Intifada was the beginning of the transition of the Palestinian territories, occupied territories, into the frontier, especially the Gaza Strip. Obviously you're seeing the use of F-35s or F-16s bombing, the use of drones, rockets, all that kind of stuff, Apache helicopters, in a way that you didn't see in the 80s and early 90s. And it's, happening to an extent in the West Bank as well. But maybe you can touch on that aspect of a little bit and just succinctly so we can move on quickly. You're muted, yeah.
I think it's very important to note that the Israel of the 1980s was a different Israel from that of the 2000s and onwards. That's not to say that the settler colonial project was different. I'm just saying, I'm talking about the political mindset and the political culture and what was acceptable in Israel and what wasn't. So yeah, I agree that in the first Intifada, it was more brutal policing with the idea of making the occupation permanent. In the second Intifada, it was more an assertion, I think, of the bottom line in Israel, which is that the West Bank in particular was going to permanently and always be part of the land of Israel. And so the idea that Palestinians have the audacity to talk about statehood, to talk about, ending the occupation, to think that they have institutions of the state, all of that had to end. And so you had the, systemic destruction, not just of physical buildings belonging to Palestinian institutions, but of the mindset that Palestinians can have something of their own. And in a way, I think, like I said, as far as one generation is concerned, that was at least in part successful. It had the opposite effect on younger Palestinians, but I think the Israelis kind of gave themselves a pat on the back and they said, well, you see, now the Palestinians understand. We beat them on the head. They understand this land belongs to us. We are the bosses. We control what happens. We've been able to sideline Gaza, keep it as a ghetto, fenced in, walled out. And now we're going to exit from Gaza, call that a gesture, say that we're no longer the occupiers and just kind of forget about it and contribute to Palestinian infighting, et cetera, et cetera. I think right now, the Israel of today considers all of that area the frontier, going back to the analogy. And not just that, I think it considers the rest of the Middle East the frontier. So as soon as it's done with us, I think there will be other ways in which it will advance its expansionist agenda. But certainly that mentality is what you see reflected in the 2017 article that Smotrich published, outlining his vision of how to subdue the Palestinians, how to make them lose hope that they can be free or be on their own. It wasn't about making them surrender. They had to lose hope, all belief that they can be free. And that's why you see extra brutality, and that's why you see an increase in everything from dispossession to home demolition to execution style killings to detention of all sorts of age groups, including minors and so on. That's the path we're on right now, and it's a very different reality from the 1980s. The world, I think, is also a lot more cowardly and open about its double standards and how it's willing to shield Israel even from the most obvious of war crimes.
Mm-hmm. I would love to dig deeper into that, to the Smotrich paper. I've kind of written about that and thought about that a lot and researched into its kind of ideological underpinnings, but I don't know if we have time for that. But I'm curious, just to kind of, stay with this a little bit longer. The Intifada did not have the effect, let's say, of forcing Israel to retreat from the occupied territories, or at least from the West Bank, maybe from the Gaza Strip. In fact, the opposite. So although, the difference between the West Bank and Gaza maybe is its own lesson, but I'm just wondering, what did Palestinians learn about Israel, as an adversary in that regard, and its responses to violence, both within the occupied territories, within Israel itself. Maybe Ramza, you can pick that one up.
Okay. Absolutely, it's an excellent question, and I agree with what Noor has said about how Israel itself has changed from the 80s, and not just in that way, but it's also ideologically. You know, what started as so-called liberal Zionism or even cultural Zionism, liberal Zionism eventually became kind of Zionist revisionism, and ultimately it became religious Zionism, where religion is actually not a tool to achieve political ends, but is the objective on its own. But the issue about armed resistance, I think it's really important, and it really does require a little bit of a pause here, because quite often we compare armed resistance to, let's say, peaceful resistance. I don't like the term myself, but it's just for the sake of the argument. But I think sometimes we fail to compare armed resistance to armed resistance, because not all armed resistance are created equal. And I think the difference, what makes certain armed resistance different, is the popular component behind that armed resistance. I think the reason that why Gaza is able to sustain its armed resistance for this number of years is not just because of, oh, this is an exclusive domain for those who carry guns, but you have a massive support network, a communal network around them that makes it possible for them to carry those guns for much longer. And I think this is why also what's going on in Nablus and Jenin in particular with the Lion's Den is, back in the day, and that's what the Israelis assumed that they could do, is to just go and what Lapid, I think it was him who referred to this a few months ago, and he said, we can just go, and there are about 30, 40 terrorists, and we just can go and eliminate them. Well, those 30, 40 so-called terrorists seems to not be going anywhere, and their number is growing. And the reason that this is happening is because of the popular resistance component that is sustaining this movement. In fact, it's making it flourish and grow beyond the boundaries of the old city of Nablus into various parts of the West Bank. So I think this is something we need to look into so that we kind of escape this reductionist take on resistance from armed versus non-armed into something else. Armed resistance can, in fact, be a popular form of resistance depending on the kind of society that exists around it. And again, Gaza, I think, is a particularly good example, and also the West Bank during the 70s. In the 70s and 80s, Gaza tried its own armed resistance with the various Fidaiyin movements, but it largely failed. The Israelis eliminated them one after the other. And there was no follow-up to that because they existed within certain ideological confines and they were not really connected to the mass of the people out there. Fatah tried armed resistance in the 70s as well. And that was a short-lived experience, again, because they could not create a popular base that would support this kind of armed resistance. What's happening in Palestine right now, I think, is quite different. And I'm not necessarily saying that it will make the ultimate difference, but it will. These are definitely sustainable movements in the long run. One final thing I'd like to add is that intifadas do not liberate land. Intifadas liberate people. And I don't think, even when Palestinians carry on with their intifadas, I don't think they are expecting that the Israeli military is going to pull out. But it liberates people in the sense it takes the initiative away from these self-serving factions and the Palestinian Authority and the politicking and the corruption and puts it back in the hands of the people. So they start forming their own communal groups, grassroots organizations and groupings and throughout the West Bank and Gaza, and they start a process of regenerating, as Frantz Fanon speaks about, the recreation of the self or the reanimation of the self. So I think Palestine uses intifadas as an opportunity to reanimate itself as a collective. And this is why I think what happened since May 2021 in Palestine could historically be considered some kind of an intifada in the future, because since then we have been witnessing the process of collective reanimation of Palestinian society.
I think that's those are two excellent points that you finished with, both in terms of what is the effect, I think, on the Palestinian people of the Intifada itself, not necessarily the liberation of land, which may come through whatever negotiations or talks or something like that, but it doesn't have to come through a military defeat of the other, but just the reinvigoration of self. And then the second point, we're running low on time. There was something I wanted to turn to that's connected to what you just said, Ramzi, and that's that there's another part of Israeli society that's we're talking about here that's often overlooked when it comes to the Intifada, overlooked in general, except in the past few years. That's Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the Intifada marked, I think, a major turning point, both in their relations to their state. In fact, I think one of the most enduring traumas within their own, perhaps distinct history is when 12 Palestinian citizens were killed by the Israeli police in the first few weeks of the Intifada during solidarity protests. And although those Palestinian citizens didn't participate in the Intifada and were sidelined by its militarization, I think you saw that in 2006, right afterwards, or starting in 2005, that intellectuals from the community inside, released the Future Vision documents, which really expressed more clearly than ever before their identification with Palestinian nationalism and part of the collectivity, and how that influenced the debate within Israel itself, the political context, which is playing part in what we see now with the nation state law in 2018 and everything that's come after it, really is connected to that. And then in May 2021, and again, the recollectivization of Palestinianism and Palestinian peoplehood under one banner and all of that kind of thing. So I kind of wanted to touch on that. I don't know if we have time because we have 8 minutes left. So I'll talk about that. I also wanted to kind of bring in your own experiences as journalists and talk about the media coverage of the Intifada and distortion and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to skip ahead to, unless you want to go back and touch with that, and I'll give it up to you. But I was going to say, how to look finally kind of how that period, the Intifada period, shaped Palestinian society in the years since. What were the longer term effects on Palestinian society, the politics, the economy? If we look at, say, how the PA was rebuilt under Abbas after it was destroyed by Sharon, it was in a way that was, in a sense, much different than how Abu Ammar had constructed it, and that the security forces were, recreated under the auspices of the United States and Israel, and have taken a much maybe different approach. I mean, in some sense, the same approach, but a different approach to Palestinian resistance on the ground, to organizing, all that kind of stuff. So maybe we can each, discuss how the legacy on shaping the reality today and where we are at. So let's start with who spoke last. Ramzi, maybe. So Noor, you want to start?
Thank you. I just want to caution. The exit from Gaza, I think, is something that we overlook. And, I know that it is studied or presented, especially by the factions in Gaza, by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as a victory, as a liberation. But I would caution against that, because I think this is one of the very wrong conclusions that some in Palestine have reached about the Second Intifada. And consequently, it had a lot of influence on what happened next and on the ongoing Palestinian division. And in that sense, I think even what you touched upon, Ramzi, the idea that in Gaza there's a lot of support for armed resistance, I don't disagree with that necessarily, but I think that we need to also dig deeper about really the dynamics governing armed resistance in Gaza, and the fact that it is, this is an area that is controlled by an armed group. And so popular opinion and the expression of disagreement is not exactly freely available. And I think that was clear maybe a little bit more in 2022, when Hamas, for its own political reasons, did not engage with Islamic Jihad in the confrontation, the brief confrontation during that summer, and people supported that because they did not want to go through another onslaught. I wanted to point out, because we're running out of time, to the ironies of covering the Second Intifada. I remember when we first started, and I would file a report to X, Y, or Z news organization, and I would be asked by the senior reporter or the editor to confirm that or corroborate that with an Israeli journalist. It was very insulting, but it was the modus operandi. We were not considered as Palestinian journalists to be objective enough, although Israeli journalists were taken for their word, even those who were involved, or had connections to the security establishment, who had served in the army. I remember during 2002, one of my colleagues called a supplier to order tapes at the time to cover the invasion, and the supplier answered him, and he said, I can't answer you. I'm in a tank invading Ramallah, and so that was never part of the story. But the fact that we were Palestinians and we were, we had already opinions about Israel, so to speak, was always taken into account. That has changed in many ways. I'm not saying that right now coverage is objective and completely professional and ethical about Palestine, but I think there's been a revolution in the conversation, and social media has contributed to that. In a way, it has forced mainstream media to allow for more space for our voices because it couldn't escape us on other platforms where it had lesser control. So I think in many ways that contributed to international solidarity, to the momentum picking up around supporting Palestinian rights, supporting Palestinian resistance, if you will, and to the way Palestinians connect to one another, and not needing traditional channels, including factions, not needing to aspire ahead to a certain ideology in order to have a conversation with other Palestinians about freedom, about resistance, about the occupation. I took too much time. I want to throw it back to Ramzi because we're running out of time, but I think that is one highlight, one very stark difference between now and then.
Thank you for that, and it's a truly unbelievable story about your media experience, and it corresponds with what I've seen in terms of Israeli journalists that are working often for the Western press that are serving as reservists in the Israeli military at the same time. And also we all remember that, the New York Times bureau chief, his son was in the Israeli military at the time he was the bureau chief. So that there's that kind of hypocrisy there. Ramzi, do you want to have some concluding thoughts here? And maybe you can also bring in, maybe the parallels to today. Obviously, we see the provocations that are happening from this current government with Itamar Ben-Gvir, going to Al-Aqsa, the marches in the West Bank and all that kind of stuff seem to be provocative in the same way that the Sharon and everyone else was back then. Go ahead, please.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Omar. Just a quick note, when I'm talking about armed resistance, I'm talking about armed resistance as phenomena as opposed to specific events. And yes, of course, point taken regarding the Islamic Jihad. I think that was May 2022 when Hamas kind of refrained from entering into the fray and provided logistical supports or space, but did not get engaged directly. And that's a different conversation. I've written actually about it. There's an article out there that was syndicated. Is available in the Palestine Chronicle and Middle East Monitor, among other news websites, where I try to explain what has actually happened. But again, I'm of course talking about why does armed resistance succeed and is prolonged and sustainable in some areas and not in others. And one element, I think you were talking, Omar, asking about the economic component of all of this. I mean, let's remember, the Netanyahu's economic piece, this ludicrous idea, which, by the way, did not start with Netanyahu himself. I think it was in 2015, if I remember correctly. Even before the first Intifada, there was this push among Israeli politicians. The situation is dire, people are not happy. So the only solution is let's just funnel a little bit of money. Maybe they need jobs, and then they will forget about their political rights. And who cares about freedom if you get paid? Really, that was kind of the idea. And the Israelis and the Americans have played that card pretty well. So after before the after the first Intifada, we have seen how the Palestinian authority kind of arrived, the idea was we just need to channel more money into the Palestinian society. The same thing happened with the second Intifada, where Palestinians are now, many of them are, 30%, I think, of all Palestinian society get paid from the Palestinian Authority. They are the Palestine's largest employer. Many of them have taken loans. They live on credit card payments and that sort of thing. And the economic aspect makes things really quite complicated. And again, we don't talk about it, and maybe because it's not the most exciting subject to talk about, but it really is quite critical. For example, the first Intifada, towards the end of the first Intifada, where it started dwindling, it was the time where the Iraq War was taking place, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the Gulf found themselves unemployed, and they are unable to send money to support their families in Gaza and the West Bank. And as a result, you have this, the strikes happening in Palestine, complete economic shutdown going on throughout Palestine. And then on the other hand, whatever little money that was being trickled down from the Gulf suddenly stopped. And that socioeconomic component was extremely relevant of why the Intifada has ended, among other reasons as well. And now I suspect that there will be some more talks with the Palestinian Authority and Israel and the United States. What can we do to stop this from turning into an Intifada? And one last thing I want to say about the relationship between arms and money is that wherever there is a revolt anywhere in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority immediately comes and offers these young men jobs. Just drop your weapons, join the Palestinian security forces, get paid handsomely at the end of the month, everything is going to be okay. This time, however, the offer was rejected. The Lions then said absolutely not, and they would not kind of take that offer that other members of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades and others have accepted actually in recent years, which means that this time the issue is not really about jobs. It's not about economy. It's not about socioeconomic status, about something entirely different. There is a national project that is being constructed in Palestine at the moment. The provocations of today, it's really quite interesting what Ben Gvir and others are trying to do, as if Ben Gvir, by going to Al-Aqsa and leading all these marches, yesterday, I think near Nablus, 17,000 Israeli settlers went and provoked Palestinians near Nablus. It's as if they are trying to provoke Palestinians into the kind of unrest, if you will, and sorry to be using this kind of generic term, but the kind of unrest that would justify certain kind of political actions on the part of the Israeli government. But I think this time around, the Palestinians are playing a different kind of game, or at least I want to believe that they are playing a different kind of game. And perhaps that explains why the Hamas did not engage in a full-scale war with Israel in May 2022. There is this idea that we can't play games around, or we cannot always be on the reaction side. We can't just allow Israel to dictate the terms and we just go out there in a full-blown Intifada and allow Israel to dictate the outcomes. This could possibly be the reason of why all of this is happening. But for the first time in many years, at least for me as someone who tries to be a historian and a political analyst, I begin to see that Israel, for the first time, the one that is being somewhat cornered, that Palestinians are operating based on a new type of strategy, and they are behaving more cautiously than they did during the second Intifada. We don't know where all of this is going to go, but it seems to me that there is a new generation of Palestinians who are thinking around different type of dialectics. And this could indeed be a game changer in the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, but with the relationship between the various intifadas and the Israeli occupation.
Those are some really excellent points that I would love to carry the conversation on further. Unfortunately, we've strayed a few minutes past the hour, so we're going to have to wrap up. So I just really want to thank you, our guests, Noor and Ramzi, for your incredible insights on this topic. And thank you to our audience for joining the Middle East Council for this webinar. Please check out our website for other content, and you can look at our YouTube channel to see other webinars. Thank you so much. Have a great day and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.